You are sitting at the edge of camp. It is roughly 40,000 years ago. Everyone else is asleep. Across the fire, a woman you have known your entire life is awake. She has been awake for 3 days. She is speaking to someone who is not there. Her eyes are tracking something, moving through the air above the camp that no one else can see. She has not eaten. When you approach her, she looks at you the way she would look at a stranger, or something worse than a stranger. She is still physically present. She is sitting in the same camp, breathing the same air, wrapped in the same skins. But the person you have known, the one who tracked animals better than anyone in the group, who knew which plants grew near water, who helped to deliver 3 of the children currently sleeping nearby, that person is somewhere else entirely, and nobody in that camp of 30 people knows where she went, or whether she is coming back. This moment, some version of it, happened in every human group that has ever existed. Schizophrenia, severe depression, mania, psychosis. These are not modern inventions. They did not arrive with cities, or stress, or screens. They are as old as the human brain that generates them. And what ancient humans did when it happened to someone they knew reveals something about early human society that almost no one talks about. Psychiatric conditions are not new. The genetic variants associated with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depressive disorder have been identified in ancient DNA samples stretching back tens of thousands of years. They are not mutations that arose in response to modern life. They are features of the human genome that predate agriculture, predate civilization, predate language as we know it. They were present in the populations that painted the caves of Lascaux and built the structures at Göbekli Tepe, which raises a question that evolutionary biology has been quietly wrestling with for decades. If these conditions are so debilitating, if schizophrenia reduces reproductive success, if severe depression makes basic functioning impossible, if mania drives people toward decisions that get them killed, why are they still here? Why did natural selection, which eliminated countless other disadvantageous traits across millions of years, leave these in place? The answer is not simple, but it is more interesting than the question. Psychiatrist Tim Crow at Oxford spent years arguing that schizophrenia is not a disease in the traditional sense, not a pathogen that invaded the human genome from outside, but a consequence of the same genetic architecture that produced language, the cognitive systems that allow humans to generate symbolic thought, to construct mental models of things that don't exist, to hear an internal voice narrating experience. Those same systems, pushed past a certain threshold, produce the symptoms of psychosis. The capacity for abstract thought and the vulnerability to certain kinds of mental breakdown may be 2 expressions of the same underlying biology. The human brain that looked up at the Milky Way and invented gods. The human brain that hears voices when no one is speaking, closer to each other, genetically, than anyone is comfortable admitting. But knowing why these conditions exist doesn't tell us what it was like to live with them. The natural assumption is that in a brutal ancient world, a mind that couldn't function was a burden the group couldn't carry. The archaeological record has already demolished this assumption for physical disability. The skeletal evidence from sites like Shanidar Cave and La Chapelle aux Saints shows sustained, resource-intensive care of physically incapacitated individuals across years. But psychological disability left almost no skeletal trace, which meant, for a long time, that researchers simply didn't look. The assumption filled the gap that evidence couldn't reach. Anthropologist and psychiatrist Julie Magruder spent years studying schizophrenia across different cultures, specifically looking at outcomes for people with schizophrenia in traditional versus industrialized societies. What she found fundamentally challenged the assumption that modern medicine produces the best outcomes for severe mental illness. People with schizophrenia living in traditional community-based societies, where extended family networks remained intact, where the person continued to live within their original social group, where the community developed its own framework for understanding and accommodating the individual's changed behavior, showed significantly better long-term outcomes than people with the same diagnosis in industrialized Western societies. More stable functioning, lower rates of complete social disintegration, higher rates of partial or full remission. The variable that predicted outcome was not medication. It was community. This finding points towards something the ethnographic record makes concrete. Traditional and indigenous cultures across every continent have developed frameworks for understanding severe mental illness that do not map onto the modern clinical model, but that functionally achieved something the clinical model still struggles with. They gave the altered behavior a meaning that kept the person inside the social fabric, rather than removing them from it. A person experiencing what modern psychiatry would diagnose as a psychotic episode, hearing voices, seeing things others couldn't see, speaking in patterns no one else could follow, was not, in many traditional frameworks, simply broken. They were, in many cultural systems, understood to be in contact with something beyond ordinary perception, a spirit world, an ancestor, a force that ordinary consciousness couldn't access. This was not naive. It was not a failure to understand what was happening. It was a different framework for the same observation, that this person's experience of reality had shifted in ways that placed them outside ordinary social functioning, but potentially inside something else. The functional consequence of that framework was significant. Instead of removing the person from the group, which in an ancient context meant death, the community reorganized around them. Their altered behavior was assigned a role, sometimes as a healer, someone whose access to non-ordinary states made them useful for the group's ritual and spiritual life. Sometimes as a warning system, someone whose patterns of perception flagged things the rest of the group had learned to take seriously. Sometimes simply as someone who required care, which the group provided because the social bonds that held the community together were not conditional on productivity. Anthropologist Weston LaBarre, surveying shamanistic traditions across cultures, found that the experiential profile of the shaman, the visions, the voices, the periods of altered consciousness, the capacity to move between ordinary and non-ordinary states, overlapped substantially with what modern psychiatry would recognize as symptoms of psychotic or dissociative conditions. This was not a coincidence. In many traditional communities, the person whose mind moved differently was precisely the person selected for the role that required a mind that moved differently. The group didn't lose a functioning member, they gained a specialist. But the picture is not clean, and the script would be dishonest if it stopped there. Not every ancient community responded to severe mental illness with integration and accommodation. The ethnographic record is not uniformly compassionate. There are documented cases across multiple cultures of individuals experiencing severe psychiatric breaks being subjected to practices that ranged from isolating to genuinely brutal, restraint, abandonment in extreme cases, ritual interventions that caused real physical harm. The variation was not random. It tracked the severity and the trajectory of the condition. A person who experienced periodic episodes and functioned between them, who could contribute to the group during stable periods, was far more likely to be integrated and accommodated. A person in a permanent, unremitting psychotic state, incapable of any functional contribution, presenting as dangerous or deeply disruptive to the group's basic operations, faced a different calculus. The same reverse dominance hierarchy that ancient groups used to manage violent or dangerously antisocial individuals applied here. A person whose altered state made them unpredictably aggressive, who couldn't be relied on to behave within the bounds that group survival required, was a structural problem the group had to solve. The solutions were not always gentle. This is not a comfortable thing to say, but it is what the evidence shows. Ancient compassion was real, widespread, and often extraordinary. It was also not unconditional. The group's investment in its members was genuine and deep. It was not infinite. What this tells us about the ancient human mind is something that modern psychiatry is only beginning to articulate. The categories we use to understand mental illness, the clean diagnostic lines between schizophrenia and creativity, between depression and adaptive grief, between mania and productive intensity, are categories built in and for industrialized societies with specific assumptions about what normal functioning looks like and what it is for. Ancient humans had no such categories. What they had was a person, behaving in ways that were outside ordinary, and a group that had to figure out, through observation and experience and the accumulated wisdom of people who had seen this before, what that person's altered state meant, what it required, and what the group could do with it. Sometimes the answer was a shaman. Sometimes it was sustained care for someone who could no longer care for themselves. Sometimes it was something harder. But the starting assumption in most ancient communities, most of the time, was not abandonment. It was attention. Careful, sustained, community-wide attention to a person whose inner world had shifted into somewhere the rest of the group couldn't follow. Think about the last time your own mind turned on you. Not a breakdown, something smaller. A stretch of days when the thoughts wouldn't settle, when the internal noise was louder than anything outside, when you looked at your own familiar life and felt, for reasons you couldn't name, that you were watching it from somewhere slightly outside it. You probably handled it alone, or nearly alone, in a world of 8 billion people. Genuine psychological distress is one of the most isolating experiences a human being can have. Your ancient ancestor, in a group of 30 people who had known them their entire life, did not handle it alone, could not have handled it alone, even if they wanted to. The group was too close, the relationships too tight, the observation too constant, for anyone's altered state to go unnoticed for long. Whether that attention was a comfort or a burden probably depended on the day, but it was never absent. The loneliness of modern mental illness, the specific modern experience of suffering in private, of not being seen, of having an inner world that no one around you can access, is not the human default. It is a product of the distance modern life puts between people. Your ancestors were too close together for that distance to exist, for better, and sometimes for worse.